think about what the definition of a suitability report actually is, it's pretty straightforward. So if you give a bit of advice, you're telling a client why it's suitable. The problem with a lot of regulatory documents is that they put annoying little phrases in, like among other things. I mean, if you took out among other things in that sentence, life would be actually quite easy, wouldn't it? All the paragraphs in here go, yay. So the problem is that when you look at what that means is that people can be a bit scared, so try and do too much. So what we see suitability reports doing in our experience, because we offer two services. We offer a bespoke service and a pay-as-you-go service. The bespoke service, we take in whatever the firm wants us to do. So we've seen lots and lots of different things. And the problems that we sometimes see is that people satisfy their suitability obligations because you do have obligations. And I'll run through those in a second just so you can see how light they actually are. What they're also trying to do is make it interesting for the client. So the cash flows and all the bits and pieces, that's really, really important. Separate to the plan is separate to the implementation. And then they're also thinking about all the things that compliance suggests that they need to put in there. And we deal with all sorts of different networks and directly authorized people and all the rest of it. But what that means is that reports tend to just be big. They're too big, 40 pages. It's like, it's just really unfair for the poor dog that it falls through the letterbox onto. What we see generally is the bulk of a report is compliance guff. Anyone know what CYA? Exactly. The problem with this is that everyone thinks you need to put these things in a report to keep yourself safe. You've got to protect yourself. That's exactly what someone said. We've got to put this in to protect ourselves. Sterling, I think it was. This is, we have to do this. This is what compliance says. We've got to cover our ass. Sorry, I'm not allowed to say rude words. Truth is, we've got a guy who used to work at the Ombudsman, works in our team. The Ombudsman isn't a judicial service, okay? The regulator is the one who sets the rules. It's the Ombudsman you need to be scared of, okay? Because the Ombudsman are the ones that will actually set any kind of penalties or fines. For the regulator to impose something on you, you've basically got to be an axe murderer. So it's the Ombudsman that you want to focus on. And the Ombudsman isn't a judicial service. It's not going to look at a letter and say, oh yes, I can see you've wriggled out of the suitability obligations here because you said this little phrase here about this. So don't be scared of leaving stuff like, the covering your arse stuff out. Think of the client. That's what the regulator wants to see. I said it again, I'm really sorry. Next one, standard text. The next kind of bulk of the report comes in standard text. A SIP is a thing that, you can borrow money and all the rest of it. You don't need to put that into the report if you don't want to. All of these things are guidance. This isn't me telling you this is what you should do or what you have to do and all the rest of it. This is just ideas. Standard definitions, glossaries, maybe what you want to do is set up a relationship with the client in a slightly different way, so that what you do is perhaps when they engage you, you have a folder that talks about the glossaries of all the different products that they might be encountering in their relationship with you. Or maybe you have a client portal on the website that talks about all these different things. It doesn't have to go into the suitability letter. If you look at COBS 9.4, it doesn't say if you recommend a SIP, you've got to give a massive 5-page definition of what a SIP is. The next part, the next kind of smallest bit, advice. What the client should actually do. That's actually quite sexy for the client. That's what they've come to advisors for. That's what they want to know. And when you kind of look at how much of a report is taken up with that, that's the bit that they're interested in. And if that's all the report needs to be, awesome. And the last bit is the bit about the client themselves. So who they are, what their objectives are. That tends to be right at the beginning, current circumstance. You are age 59. You're a lawyer. If you think about focusing a report around a client and making it readable for them, it needs to be something they can relate to. So if you flip that, if you think about flipping that and putting the compliance guff as the little bit at the top, and actually the client and their objectives as the massive bit at the bottom, that's probably going to be a nicer report for a client to read. What do you have to do? This is what COBS 9.4 says you have to do. 4 things, okay? You've got to specify the client's demands. You've got to explain why the transaction is suitable. You've got to explain any disadvantages. Happy with that? If that was all a suitability report needed to be, we'd all be happy. That's like a page, isn't it? But then they chuck in this hideous phrase, give the client such details as are appropriate according to the complexity of the transaction. I mean, where does that end? Where does it start? It's kind of massive, really, when you think about it. So that's the big bit that people hide behind when they say you've got to have that in a report and you've got to have that in a report. So what I'm going to do is just quickly break those 4 bits down and just kind of give you some practical things to sort of take away. So the first 3 bits, what you've got there is your obligations, okay? You have 2 levels of obligation under COBS. You've got fact-finding obligations and then you've got your suitability obligations. Your fact-finding obligations, if you distill, you take all the kind of legalese out of COBS, there's 3 things that you need to do. You've got to find out the client's investment experience, you've got to understand their financial situation and their objectives. That's why you fact-find. Having a 60-page fact-find is fine if you want to know all the intricacies and all the rest of it, but all the regulator wants to know is that's what you found out. One of the things that we often encounter is clients say, well, I'm not going to do a pension transfer unless there's a written statement from the client saying that the transfer value on the 8th of March was this and that. The regulator doesn't need that. If you read what they want, you can actually use information the client gives you, but you've got to make sufficient action to prove whether it's accurate or not. So just chill out, basically. When you look at the suitability report obligations, they actually sit really nicely next to each other. So when you're writing your report, you can just link it straight back to the fact find. So you've got to find out the client's investment experience, and then in the report, you've got to say how you understand that the risks involved in the transaction work for that client. What's their experience? How does the recommendation you've made match that experience? Recommend you do an ISA. You've done an ISA before, so you're cool. Financial situation. How does that work in relation to how the client can financially bear the investment risks? That's capacity for loss. That's the bit that Brod was talking about earlier with your cash flows. You know, the cash flows, if you do sexy big cash flows, awesome. You're going to nail a plan, you're going to have client loyalty and all the rest of it. If you do a nice, simple, elegant cash flow, just working out how much the client can afford to lose, you're satisfying that you can prove how much the client can financially bear in terms of investment risks. And the third one, understanding their objectives and showing how your recommendations meet those objectives. So don't get hung up on trying to do everything in a report. You know, keep it nice and elegant, and the regulator will be happy. One of the things that they like to see when they do look at businesses, they tend to look at the protocols at the top of a business. So they'll look at the CIP and the processes and how things are managed. If they're happy with that, they tend to kind of float away. And you can control those sorts of processes by having these sorts of things right at the heart of everything that's done. The most important bit for you as businesses is actually the third bit, which isn't a regulatory obligation other than your service proposition. So in your service proposition, you're saying to the client, I'm going to charge you 0.5%, I'm going to charge you 1%, whatever it ultimately is, and I'm going to deliver this service. That's the bit where you get that client loyalty. Because once you've got the client loyalty, they stay with you as a client, because ultimately your success going forward is based on having client loyalty. You haven't got that kind of cross-pollination that there used to be. So you keep the regulator happy, keep the client happy, job done. Easy? Except we didn't touch on that fourth one. Give the client such details as are appropriate according to the complexity of the transaction. I'll give you a little freebie. You can see it in your slide list there. We do a NAF. We love NAF acronyms. So what we do is when we look at a case, we try and cover off these points when we're looking at trying to give such details as are appropriate to the complexity of the transaction. So the first thing that we look at is cost. So analysing cost shouldn't be complicated. Like I said earlier, don't get hung up on having pension projections to do a pension transfer. What the regulator wants to see is a consistent comparison. So whatever means that is, it needs to be the same on either side of the transaction. We do a reduction in yield calculation, which basically takes all of the existing charges, all of the penalties to move, initial advisor costs, the term of investment, and what it does, it boils it down into 2 numbers. So if the client stays, it's going to be 1.34% per annum reduction in yield. If the client moves, it's going to be 1.44% per annum reduction in yield. So what that does, it takes all of the implications of cost and puts it down into two simple numbers for the client to understand. What that means is that if it's more expensive, you can state specifically, right, it's more expensive, it's 0.1% more expensive, but that is commensurate for the additional benefit that you're going to get for moving, okay? Risk, analyze risk on each bit of the transaction that you're recommending. So you might recommend some investments and you might recommend some pensions, consolidating them all in one place. What you might do is actually apply different risk to each part of that. So the investments may have a different risk profile to the pensions because the client's capacity for loss is slightly different based on the term of the investment. But if you specify that individually, you can't go too far wrong. Existing arrangements. What should you do with existing arrangements? You know, what action needs to be taken? Do they need to be kind of shuffled about? And that also relates to the assets that remain. So if you've got 4 pensions on a case, 3 of them are pretty awful, you can consolidate those and the client gets a good outcome. One of them actually though has a really good guaranteed annuity rate. Do you need to shuffle the investment profile around? Do you need to do anything with it to make it consistent with the 3 bits of fact finding that you did earlier? Tax, I'm not a technician, I'm an idiot. The clever people that work in my business would tell you all the different intricacies of the tax. So investment bond, if you're in cash and investment bond because it's no longer appropriate and you put it into a CGT portfolio and an ISA, what's the tax implications pre and post transaction? How does that compare for that client? The ultimate goal that the client has, if you put an ultimate goal on every single bit of advice that you put and you relate it back to the client's objectives, you can't fail because the client has stated that's their objectives and you're showing how you're going to achieve that for them. The review frequency, we tend to suggest that you obviously have your reviews as a planning relationship, so your annual, half yearly, for your 0.5%, 1%, whatever you're charging. But if you also put in a frequency of reviews for your products, each individual product, you can just create a nice bit of consistency as well there. So, you know, if you put a whole of life plan in place, a maximum sum assured whole of life plan in place for a client who's doing something, fine, that's reviewed annually, yes, but ultimately the product review is structured around 10 years. And that also relates quite nicely to the client's expectations. If you put them into something they can't touch for 2 years, you need to tell them that right at the beginning. So that relates back to my tortured analogy with the bags. Managing the client's expectations, letting them know what to expect, giving them bad news. You know, we are providing a service to our clients. Sometimes we do stuff late. That happens. But we try and tell our clients to say, look, it's going to be a few days late. We're really sorry. But they know and they can manage it. It's not good news. It's not nice news, but it's news. So basically what you've got is creature comforts. Thought that one up myself. You can have it. My pleasure. That's pretty much it, really. Things to avoid. Reasons why not. We work with a few networks and they love this. You know, I've recommended you do an ISA. Lovely, okay, but I haven't recommended you do a SIP for these reasons, and I haven't recommended you do a VCT for these reasons. I definitely didn't recommend you do a bit of protection for these reasons, okay? Reasons why not is hideous, absolutely hideous. If you do it, desist. The regulator hates it. If they see it, they go, oh. You're recommending why a client should do something, not why they shouldn't do something. Creating advice with no discernible benefits. Is everyone comfortable with what that means? Do you remember FG 1216 came out a couple of years ago? My favorite regulatory document. I absolutely love FG 1216. It looked at replacement business for centralized investment propositions and all those sorts of things. Analyzed 181 client files from 18 different firms and basically tried to create good and bad practice. 3 things came out of bad practice. There's the old favorite shoehorning and churning, and then a third, which not many people pick up on, is no discernible benefit. What you're looking at there is creating a situation where you might recommend a client move to something more expensive, but you don't justify why. It might be better for them, but if you tell them specifically, look, this is costing you more, but you get all this extra stuff, and you want that extra stuff, it satisfies your objectives. It doesn't need to be a happy outcome, so you can't accidentally move a client to something that's more expensive and, you know, it's got to link to the objectives. The other sorts of no discernible benefit that you desperately need to avoid is telling a client to move because they'll get better investment performance. You've got no control over that. You've got no ability to promise that. And if you say that a client should move because they'll get better investment performance, you will get jumped on. Generic text. That's less a regulatory requirement and more just good practice. If you put generic text in, it just doesn't feel a personalized thing. Other sorts of things are kind of jargon and waffle. You know, again, if you alienate the client by using jargon, and if you make it really waffly without specific instructions, it's just quite hard to read, basically. Last one is Franklin's Gambit, which is it's quite a hot thing at the moment with the regulator looking at due diligence and research on their kind of thematic review at the moment. Franklin's Gambit is going into a situation with kind of a predetermined outcome, so trying to skew something to be appropriate. So I think Dave was talking earlier about the broker bonds, you know, 95% happening to suitably fit this requirement. When the regulator looks at files, or when Ombudsman looks at files, if they see kind of consistent themes, it means that there's Franklin's Gambit in place. It means you're going with a predetermined expectation of what's going to happen. Kind of retrofitting advice, if you like. Good practice, specific and kind of real client objectives. What we kind of encourage people to do is, if you've got clients, do the hard fact-finding with them by all means, but maybe do a separate soft fact-finding session, because, or maybe even before the meeting, send them some questions to talk about amongst themselves so that you can kind of get real objectives that the clients want. You know, they can be thinking about these, talking about it over dinner, you meet them and they've thought about it before you've got there and said, so, what are your financial objectives? Real objectives also just put a lot of context around the advice. If you create solutions to those objectives, that's instantly nailing those first three requirements under the COBS 9.4. An elegant summary we quite like, because some people don't want the technical stuff. They just want to know what to do. I'm sure lots of you got clients that say, look, I don't know what, just tell me what to do. And that's fine. You've done all the work on it, and the fact that they don't read the report is up to them. If there's a summary that tells them what to do, why, and what the implications are, you're kind of covering as much as you need to for those people that only need to read that. Graphics and interaction is a personal thing. Some people like it, some people don't. Again, it's just about making a bit of interest, because let's be honest, financial planning and financial advice is really dull. And if you just try and liven it up with a bit of sort of interaction, it can just be a bit more exciting. And lastly, review the suitability. So we had a chap at a previous session that said, we were talking about capacity for loss, and he said, how can I possibly, for a 37-year-old, put their capacity for loss when I'm planning a pension to age 65? And the point is, you're planning it at that point. So you're planning their capacity for loss at age 37. You're then reviewing it regularly to make sure it's still consistent with what they're trying to achieve. But reviewing is just a really good practice. Again, inside your businesses as well, reviewing decisions, you know, us reviewing our cleaner. Lastly, ignore the noise. The most important thing for you to remember is it's the file that needs to be compliant and not the report, okay? The report is a really simple, elegant document that's personalized for each person that you're dealing with, but the file can be as chunky as you want it to be. All the analysis you do, all the O&M research, all the projections, all the cash flows, you know, that's what needs to be on the file, because that's the bit that's going to justify the decisions that you made. So where you're talking about earlier, is reasons why not an important one? Maybe you have a metric within your business that says, if I've got a client that has an ISA, have I considered bonds? Have I considered unit trusts? Have I considered this? Yes, I have. This is why not. Client doesn't need to know that. Like when you go to a doctor and he gives you a course of antibiotics, you just want to know it's going to kill the infection. You don't want to know that he hasn't chopped off your leg because it's not going to achieve the same objective. You just want to know why. He's probably gone through that process, and if you've got it documented on a file, you can't go wrong. That's nearly it. I'm going to break Presenters Rule 101, which is don't mess around with the hardware, because we've got a division in our business. It sounds really grand, but it's basically a couple of blokes going to a room with, you know, a bit of technology and sort of mess around. We call it the Bernard Marx division, and we just try and think. Bernard Marx was a character in a book, kind of like a dystopian future where everyone's kind of like an automaton going in the same direction. And he sort of said, actually, if we went that way, it'd be awesome, because look, stuff's great over there. So what we try and do is just geek out a little bit about accepted norms. So we've done it with reports, we're doing it with cash flows, we're doing it with risk calculators and all sorts of stuff. But just to sort of show you the sorts of things that are a bit left field. So when you engage with a client, it doesn't have to be in the form of a Word document. What the regulator wants your suitability report to be is on a durable medium. Okay? Everyone comfortable with the concept of a durable medium? Doesn't mean a printed document. I think Nick ran through, what was it, £10,000 per advisor in printing costs? So when you kind of add it up, if you cut the costs in some way and actually go digital, it's just going to be really effective. So maybe when you engage with a client and they're in a particular segment that's got a nice profit margin, maybe it's part of that process. You give them a tablet. You know, you can get some pretty cheap tablets these days, sort of 50, 100 quid. You give them a tablet and it's formulated for your business. So every correspondence you have with them sits on that tablet. Everything that you do with them, whenever you review, it's engaged with the tablet. But what it is, do you want me to put it up on the screen actually? No, it's a bit small, isn't it? Right. Talk amongst yourself while I destroy the technology, if that's all right. So, this is the sort of thing we've got. This is what we think a report could be. It doesn't need to be a piece of paper. It doesn't need to be lots of bits and pieces. It's a document you sit and you can actually interact with the client. So maybe you bring them into the office and just go through it, or maybe you do it virtually, like Bridget suggests. Sit and, you know, go through the document together. So what you've got is a situation where the client's got a start point and an end point. So this is this transaction. It's going to do whatever it needs to do. Maybe a nice little introduction for the client. They can click on that and it says, this is what we're going to do in the report. This is what you need to think about. Then you might go to the first section, which just talks about who the client is. This is who they are. This is what they own. You know, they've got some assets. Nice little pie chart. Everyone loves a pie chart. Paraplanners, we love pie charts. But it just tells the client who they are. Run through a bit of cost and, you know, income and expenditure. Perhaps then you go through what the client's objectives actually are. So this client's got 3 objectives, and what you're doing is relaying that back in their language. So this person came to the advisor and said, this is what I want to achieve, these 3 things. No matter how left field it is, that's what the client wants to do. No client will come to you saying they want to consolidate their pensions, they want to make admin easier, they want to have online. No, and I guarantee none of them say that. What they say is, I'm really worried about my kids, you know, I want them to have a legacy, I'm really worried about paying for, you know, the next house I buy. But this person's got 3 objectives. So if we take the last one, you want to take advantage of your new tax-free income to enhance your provision in retirement. In other words, what he's doing, he's sitting there and he's saying, I've got this income, what's it going to mean to me? So what you can do is you can just run a nice, elegant cash flow, like Brod suggests. So this is taking the situation for the client from now till when they retire. And then when they retire, are they going to run out of money? Well, this person, if they achieve 5% per annum, they're fine, absolutely loaded. If they achieve 3% per annum, they're going to run out of money. But lo and behold, it happens at age 99. That's what everyone plans for, isn't it? But look, all this is trying to illustrate is that the interaction with the client, if it's a bit more dynamic and a bit more, you know, if it's not the Word documents, you know, think how many times you kind of, Word, I hate Word, but it works, you know. Taking it out, putting it into a different medium, just maybe makes it a bit more engaging. And then you end with a nice summary. This is what you should do. This is why we think you should do it. And, you know, these are the timescales and responsibilities. But yeah, just an idea, something I thought I'd share. I'll do cash flows next time. And that's it.